So McGregor Forever, 4-part series, Netflix. Watched it the other night, finished it, and in the aftermath was left with some extremely mixed feelings, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Is it because I'm a Conor McGregor fan and this was a very nihilistic look into his actual career? I couldn't quite make it out. And then I saw Conor McGregor do an interview on the Mac Life, and he was asked about the documentary, and what he said was so revealing, because as you know, Conor McGregor isn't the guy who can hide his feelings too well. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't impressed. He pulled back a small bit and he tried to give a little leeway to the documentary maker, I guess, but he didn't like it.
What did you think of the documentary when you watched it back?
I had no creative control in it. It's okay.
I think that this was a strange period in Conor's career. But not only that, I think that the aesthetic choices made by the documentary filmmaker, the editing choices, there was a lot to be questioned in there. Now, there was some extremely good parts in the documentary, and I'm going to get into the good and the bad, but just as an overall, Conor didn't like this documentary, and I can see why people will come away from it and not like it either, and I would probably include myself in that category too.
I feel like in the creative process, like there's a thin line between, oh my god, wow, it's the best thing ever, and it's okay.
I see what you mean.
It's a very thin line.
Yeah.
And as you saw there with Conor, you know, he did hold back a lot in that interview. It was actually a relief to hear that coming from his lips, because I thought that there was this upsetting feeling at the end of the documentary because nothing was achieved. And in terms of storytelling or narrative, it just wasn't there. There was no crescendo to the end of this 4-part series, and what it actually did is it asked more questions than it answered, because what was it about? Was it a sports documentary? Well, if it was a very bad one. Was it a documentary or a reality TV show about Conor McGregor? Well, if that's the case, then why were we reverting back to 10-year-old footage of an interview when he just broke on the scene? And that kind of infuriated me, because every time we scratched the surface of what actually goes on behind the curtain of Conor McGregor's world, we got pulled back to 10 years ago to this interview. And I guess he was trying to do this correlative connection between what he said he was going to do 10 years ago and what he actually achieved. But what actually ended up happening was it was distracting and very jarring. And we saw the movie Notorious before, which tracked him from the beginning, from the young ages when he was telling people before he even entered MMA that he was going to be in this industry and he was going to conquer it. And he was going to become the king of the world. And it tracked him all the way through the beginning, just from the origins of fighting in local bouts in his hometown, all the way through to beating Chad Mendes and getting the belt. And that was a documentary. That was a sports documentary. And that was a triumph of a movie. This, not so much. Now, don't get me wrong, I did enjoy a lot of it. And a lot of the stuff that I enjoyed was the stuff that we don't see. And I think we got a window into the real person here. And I don't think too many people are talking about who and what exactly Conor McGregor is. People talk about him smacking old men in pubs. People talk about him throwing dollies through windows. People talk about him having $1 billion in the bank. But they don't talk about the person. And I think that this one scratched the surface. And what we've seen through this 4-parter is a guy who suffers clearly with his mental health. And you would be mistaken for thinking that, okay, he's got $1 billion, he doesn't need to fight. You're incorrect. He needs to fight. He needs to train. He needs to have something to reach. Otherwise, the head doesn't work. And for people that understand the unconscious mind or how electrolytes work in terms of being bipolar or struggling with mental health in general, then you know that unless you can conquer the mind, nothing else will work. And that's what I saw from this, because even after the loss to Dustin, even after the loss to Khabib, we saw that he was in the gym, training super hard, ready to go again. Now, it was frustrating that there was no fights provided for him by the UFC, and we got a nice little insight into the background of that as well. Because as I said, most people see Conor McGregor as this icon, this face, this crazy Irish guy. But we saw his everyday routine where, you know, it's dark, it's dreary, he's in Dublin, you know, he's not living in the Bahamas, he's in Dublin, and he's got to get up and make his way to the gym. There's a reason for it, and now we know, because it helps his mental health. And I thought that was a fantastic insight into this documentary, probably one of the best parts of it. Again, the viral bits that are flying all over social media of him being really upset in the aftermath of the Khabib loss, yes, it was a cool scene. It was definitely a cool scene, and it did show us not a moment of weakness, but more a moment of strength, because in terms of stoicism, after the altercations that happened with that fight, Dylan Dennis, Khabib, people jumping out over, Conor himself getting attacked, getting punched in the head by 2 or 3 different people, that really didn't faze him. That was nothing. The only thing that mattered is that he was beaten. And he said it, he sat in the ground, he said, listen, this is handbags, it's a load of bollocks, I don't give a shit. I was beaten, and that's it. You know, for the normal person, when they're involved in an altercation, whether you're drunk in your bar or whether you're walking down the street and someone wants to engage in some sort of violence, that's upsetting for the normal person. That gets the tension levels really high. But that didn't affect him, because the only thing that affected him was the fact that he lost. And it really showed us how much he cares and how much he wanted. I think we all get caught up in the sound bites of Conor McGregor is sleeping in silk sheets now and he doesn't need to train and he doesn't need to fight. But what this showed was that you're incorrect. And you're just being blasé about your commentary on this man. And this is not just a game to him. He wanted to win. Everybody wants to win, but we could really see it that in this Khabib, with the rivalry being so stringent, he wanted to win. It's as simple as that. But also, he trained extremely hard, more so than I thought he did. Because on the run up to that fight, there was many news stories saying that Conor McGregor was on a 3-day bender of whiskey and God knows what, right before the fight. And to be honest with you, when you look at that fight, he looked out of sorts. He looked completely and utterly out of sorts, and this documentary showed that he put in a lot of effort for that camp. He went in there with an injury, not a massive one, but he went in there with a small injury and he fought and he did his best. And I believe that he's the only person to win a round against Khabib. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about that. So we jumped straight from the Khabib segment of the documentary to the 2 bouts with Dustin Poirier. The first one, he lost fair and square. That's fine. And the second one, we all know what happened. The leg break. He went in there injured. If you ask me, it was good to show what was happening before this fight in terms of flying to LA, seeing specialists about the ankle. For me, you just shouldn't have fought with that injury. We saw the doctor showing that anything below the ankle was going to be floppy if it hit anything with serious impact. And of course he was kicking. He was kicking all the way up to the fight, and he was kicking through the fight. And after we got to that segment in the documentary where the leg was broken, he was left with this horrific, life-changing injury. The documentary took a spiral, and it really felt like it didn't know where it was going. We actually didn't have an ending. And you know, there was a lot of questions floating around in the air, especially about the relationship between Conor and his team. I know many MMA commentators have said throughout the years that Conor should have moved away from this camp and shouldn't be so loyal to these guys, because if you look at the trajectory of his career, the fight styles haven't changed. They've been jarring. You know, we went from Eddie Alvarez to Khabib to Dustin, and the improvement was never there. We never visually looked at him and said, wow. He had a 40-second blitz against Cowboy Cerrone, and I guess everyone was like, okay, Conor's good. But in the 2 Dustin fights, definitely had moments. Definitely wasn't a whitewash. Definitely didn't get run over by Dustin like people say. You know, he actually hurt Dustin a lot, and I think if the game plan had been better, then he would have done a lot better in both fights. Obviously taking away from the serious injury. But one thing that was very evident in this documentary was that his team were a close-knit team, and they would talk about the dark times coming up to the Khabib fight, and they would talk about the positive times coming up to the Dustin fight. And we would have their voices intermittently coming in and talking about Conor and his progress and his trajectory, and that was fine. One thing that stood out massively to me, and especially given the fact that this was the clearest insight into Conor McGregor's mental health that we have ever seen, was in the aftermath of the horrific injury, it seemed like he was alone, because he had chosen for his wife and his family not to come with him for this 2nd or 3rd Dustin fight. And we had the scenes of him the day after having had surgery on the leg, being alone in a hospital. And whilst it was very short, it was very telling in terms of where you can go with your mind. You've just lost a bout that you wanted to win so much. Your family aren't with you. And it looked like his team weren't with him. And I actually voiced my anger at that point in the documentary saying, okay, where's Kavna? Where's Dana? Where's the doc? Where's Owen? There was no one there. And there was this very telling scene where he talked about, this room is very grey, it's very dark. And he meant it metaphorically in terms of the mood and where the mind was actually heading. And I believe someone said, oh, we can open the curtains and leave in some light. And he was like, no, I don't mean that. And that was the most poignant bit of the entire thing for me. And coming away from that, my heart sank because there was a feeling of this huge icon that everyone wants to be around because he's electric. And when we're in our low times and you have lost your bout, you're on your own. And he was on his own. And I think that's what Conor fears the most, being on his own, being alone with his own mind. I think that he's terrified of it. And everything else that we see is a facade. When he's really high, it's amazing. It moves mountains. When he's really low, no one is there. Nobody knows the man when he's really alone. And I think this did a decent job of showing that. So overall, whilst the filmmaking decisions weren't great with this documentary and the narrative mightn't have lived up to what we thought it was going to be, I think that there's enough in here of the man and what is behind the curtain for people to enjoy. The fact that we get to see him in his darkest times, the anguish showing on his face when Khabib retired. And he tried to hide it with a jovial laugh, but it didn't work. It didn't work, and for anyone that has suffered mentally, they know exactly what's going on. They know that there's no sleep in had that night. They know that when he wakes up the next morning, there's only one thing he's thinking about. So you can joke with all your little fake friends as much as you want, but the one thing that you want to do is to get that back against Khabib, and now there's no chance of it. So we got to see that. We got to see him engaging in the community, out in Brooklyn, cleaning churches. It was fantastic, and we had never seen that before. And I guess people are cynical and they would say he deserved more or a harsher punishment for what he did. Fine, fair enough, there's always going to be them people. They don't understand genius when they see it. And if you look at the marketing skills of this man, he is a genius. So what was billed as an MMA masterclass in documentary filmmaking or a Netflix exclusive turned out to be a disappointment for the majority of people, including Conor McGregor. And for me, coming off the back of this, I've got more respect for Conor McGregor than ever. I don't know whether he's going to go forward and get himself back in shape and win the Michael Chandler fight. But what I do know is that there's so much more to Conor McGregor, and we got to see it in this 4-part documentary.